Alright, so we're looking at time zones this lesson, and we're going to do both Australian and international time zones in one big hit. So, looking at this is just a map of Australia, okay? And basically, because we're in New South Wales, we're going to be using that as our point of reference, and because it is the most populous state, definitely by far, but probably not at time of recording. Anyway, the point is that we're going to be using that as our point of reference, and everything's going to be behind us. And this actually matches the international time zones as well. But it all depends on where you're located as well in what you do. Like, so if you're in Perth, for example, you'd probably have like plus 2.5 hours or 3 hours depending on which way you're going. Anyway, the point is, if you were in New South Wales and you were in Sydney and you wanted to know what the time was in Perth, then you would just subtract 3 hours. It's that simple. Okay, during daylight savings time, I believe it's daylight savings time. Queensland is an hour behind. Okay, so, or are they always an hour behind? Many countries adopt daylight savings during the warmer half of the year to take advantage of the extra hours of daylight. In Australia, this involves advancing clocks by 1 hour at the start of October and adjusting back at April. During daylight savings, our time zones are an extra hour ahead of the standard time zones, except in Queensland, the Northern Territory, and Western Australia, the states that do not participate in daylight savings. The map below shows the 5 time zones in Australia during daylight savings. So this is when daylight savings is occurring. Okay, so as you can see, Queensland is 1 hour ahead of New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania. Northern Territory is minus 1.5 hours behind New South Wales, Victoria, so it's a half an hour behind, plus an extra hour for daylight savings time. Okay, but if it wasn't during daylight savings times, then this would be the same as this, and this one would be the same as this as well. In fact, do they have a... They do. Here's the other map here. So this is the other map. So you can see Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania are all the same. Northern Territory and South Australia are only half an hour behind. And then Western Australia is actually 2 hours behind during daylight savings time. Well, not during daylight saving time, and 3 hours behind during daylight savings time. So, let's look at this first one. If it was like, say, 3 p.m. in Sydney, then in Western Australia, because it's 2 hours behind, you subtract 2 hours from 3 p.m. So 2 p.m., 1 p.m. So in Perth, it'd be 1 p.m. Okay, it's basically it. If it was 5 a.m. in Western Australia, okay, then you need to know what time it was in, say, Darwin. Okay, so from negative 2 hours to negative a half hour is 1.5 hours, so you'd have to add 1.5 hours on. So 5 a.m. would be 6:30 a.m. in Darwin. Now during during daylight savings time, this is a little bit different, of course, where you've got, say, in New South Wales, if it was 9 a.m., then in Perth it would be 6 a.m. because it's 3 hours behind. Okay, if it was, say, 2 p.m. in Adelaide. Excuse me. If it was 2 p.m. in Adelaide, okay, and you want to know the time in, say, Darwin, the difference in time between these two is actually only 1 hour because they're normally in the same time zone, but because it's daylight savings time, it's a difference of an hour. So if it was, what did I say? No, let's say if it was 5 p.m. in Adelaide, then it'd be 4 p.m. in Darwin. Okay, so it's an extra hour behind. Okay, and that's pretty much it for the Australian time zones. Now, when it comes to we've done that one already. When it comes to the world's time zones and the world's daylight zones, okay, we've got our lines of longitude, which we learned about in a previous lesson. Okay, so you've got like the 0 degrees, which is the equator, and it goes up 20, 40, 60, 80. Okay, and 90 would be right at the top, and it comes down 20, 40, 60, and then of course Antarctica would be down here somewhere. Okay, and you can kind of see where everything is. So each of these lines in this one represent 2 hours, okay? So Sydney, when it's 10 p.m, over in Perth, it's hitting the 8 p.m. box, okay? So it depends on if it's daylight saving time or not. Will depend on what that time is going to be. So the center we call Greenwich Meridian because it goes through Greenwich, okay, and we call it UTC, and it's 0, okay, so it's where time essentially starts. everything to the right of the UTC is given a plus number. So if this was at, say, at noon, so like at 00, and +2, +4, +6, at 12, like 12 in the middle of the day, then +2, +2, +2, +2, +2, which is +10, would be 10 p.m. in Sydney. So if it was 12 in the midday in Greenwich. Okay, then obviously going backwards for the west. Now, if you jump over the international date line, basically this is where the day changes. So, for example, up here in, I believe, where would that be? That would be on the edge of Russia. Okay, if you were on the edge of Russia, and it was, one day, then over here in Alaska, it might be another day of the, say it's like Wednesday in Alaska, it might be Tuesday if it's Wednesday in Russia, it might be Tuesday in Alaska, okay? Depending on what time it is. And in most cases, it's probably going to be the case. There's not going to be too much overlap between those two. And the fact that if you go back there, you could technically be going back in time. But of course, the further and further you travel to the right, the further in time you go until you jump over that point and you go back a day. So some of you who may have traveled overseas before the pandemic may have traveled from Sydney, and you may have traveled to, say, Los Angeles or San Francisco, which is over here. So instead of traveling all of this way, all the way across the whole world, you do actually travel across the international date line, and you would have actually traveled. So you can see New Zealand here and here. So New Zealand on this side, it's the same on this side. So Australia is just over here. You might have actually flown over this way. Well, you would have, in fact. And you actually would have had to travel across the international date line. So you're technically going back in time. But then when you come back to Sydney, then you have to go through that international date line again, and then you're adding on a day. So you're gaining that day back. So you don't technically go through time because you're still making up for that time. The only time I guess you could is if you moved to, say, the United States and you never moved back to Australia. So if you were born in Australia, you moved to the United States and never moved back. I guess you could say then you're technically losing. You gained a day. You're going back in time, so that's pretty cool. I know my brother, for example, he went to America on his birthday, on New Year's Day, and he left Sydney on his birthday on New Year's Eve, and he arrived in the United States on New Year's Eve, so he got to travel. He got to celebrate his birthday 2 times, so that was pretty cool. Okay, so let's say we had, so let's have a look at this one here. This table shows various cities. Okay. So it's telling you basically where each cities are and how much from the center it is. So the center, London, Dublin, and I don't know how to pronounce that. My geography skills aren't my best. But basically, if you're going back, so like say you wanted to go to Atlanta in the States from London, then you would subtract -5 hours, okay? And you just look at the difference in the hours. So say, for example, you wanted to go from Chicago, which is at -6, to Honolulu, which is at -10, then the jump is 4. So you're going to go back 4 hours. Then, of course, if you wanted to, say, go from Rio de Janeiro at -3 to, say, Perth, which is +8, then -3 to 0 is 3, then 0 to 8 is 8, obviously. So 8 plus 3, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it, but it works, trust me. So -3, which is 3 hours from -3 to 0. 0 to 8 is 8 hours. So the total amount of hours difference is the total amount of hours is 11. Okay, basically that. So the type of questions you're going to be asked to do for this are basically going to be how many hours are in between these. If it's like, so say it was like 2 a.m. on this particular day, then what time and day is it in, say, like, if it was in Tokyo, then what time was it in Sydney? So you would add an hour on. So basically stuff like that. And you just have to think about the time to do that. Okay. So that's basically it. I'll leave it with you guys. Have a go at the worksheet that's attached. Cheers.